Okay, well, welcome everyone to the latest Monday Majlis, in which I will be in conversation with Professor Vernon Schubel, who is Professor of Religious Studies at Kenyon College, and we'll be talking about his recent book, Teaching Humanity. And yes, there it is. I'll put a link in the chat later anyway as well, so that people know about it a bit more. Um, we will of course he will be presenting on the book in a bit, but as is our custom, which is started by my colleague who I can see right now, Istvan. We'll start with a few questions about his journey and also some maybe if he has any um, advice for our grad students. But uh, Vernon, welcome to the Monday Majlis at
Thank
Exeter.
you.
And yes, if I can ask you the first question, which is, can you tell us a bit about your intellectual journey? How did you come to the study of Islam?
Oh, it's really complicated. It's basically chapter one of the book. You know, I graduated high school in America in 1969, which was at the height of the end of the Vietnam War, the rise of counterculture movements. Lots of people interested in things that were non-Christian and non-Western at a level that had not been the case in popular culture for a long time. And I went off to college and proceeded to not do very well. I dropped out to be in a rock and roll band and went out to California and tried to get a record contract. And that fell through. But all during that time, I kept reading about Eastern religions and, that sort of seeker mentality that a lot of us had in the 60s and 70s. And when I got to Oklahoma State University, which had a remarkable religious studies department at that time, uh, I was taking a course on Indian, South Asian religions. And we had done all the stuff that I thought was going to be interesting, right? We had done Bhakti and we had done Buddhism, we had done Jainism. When we got to Islam, I thought, oh, this is going to be boring. This is going to be the Protestant Christian God who tells you the things that you can't do, and a sort of sober monotheism. And the professor, who was actually, I'm told, the first female graduate of Columbia University's divinity school, had grown up in Lahore in the 1930s. And she started with the Urs of Muinuddin Chishti and all of these images of malangs and people playing Qawwali music. And I thought, this is Islam? And I was really instantaneously hooked by the power and the beauty of those images, and really decided then, I've got to learn Urdu. I've got to travel to that part of the world. I want to learn about these things. And so my interest really shifted to Islam, primarily in Shiism and Sufism, and following the advice of my professor there, I went to study at the University of Virginia, where a number of things happened to me intellectually. It was 1978. Me and my advisor both read Edward Said's Orientalism at the same time. He based his courses around Marshall Hartson's The Venture of Islam, and that was also life-changing. And one of my professors was the late Victor Turner, who, given my experiences as a performer and as a musician, really turned me on to the notion of religion as performance, and as something that speaks to the emotional and ecstatic elements. Uh, and at that point, I first went and did my dissertation research on Muharram in Karachi. And while there, began to see connections between devotional allegiance to the family of the Prophet in both the Sufi and Shi traditions. I went back to Multan to study Sufism in Pakistan. Then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I started studying Uzbek so I could go to Samarkand and Bukhara, and started studying the reemergence of the Sufi tradition there. And from there, I got interested in Alevis in Turkey. And, all these years later, I finally put together all the things that I had been teaching that I hadn't written down into this book, which wants to introduce Islam in a new way.
That's quite comprehensive in many ways. We will we'll come to the book, and I'll say maybe ask you a bit more about why this book. But um, as I mentioned, we often ask our guests to maybe highlight one or perhaps two things that you would say to our grad students, as words of encouragement, or, something that you hope that you'd been told as a grad student, which would kind of keep you on course. And, any sort of good advice that you would have.
Well, one really practical one.
Yeah.
I know you guys are really focused on your dissertations, and sometimes your dissertations are really focused. But when you show up for a job interview, the chances that you're going to be at an R1 research place on your first job really pretty slim. So you're more likely to be going to some liberal arts college or to what we call in the States an ERN place, Western Michigan or Eastern Missouri. And they're going to ask you, can you teach a course on introduction to religion? And they're going to ask you, what would you put in that course?
Mm.
And your ability to be able to speak outside your area of expertise, to be able to demonstrate that you can generally talk about not just Islam, but about how Islam fits globally into human history, into the rest of world religions. And well, I don't like the term world religions for a lot of reasons, but of religions, your ability to demonstrate that you can communicate to undergraduates without talking in the jargon of our field, that goes a long way, because sitting on the other side of that panel for 30 years, the number of people who, when you said, what would you teach besides Intro to Islam, say, I want to read these Arabic texts with my students at a
Yeah.
place that doesn't have Arabic. And you would think nobody does that. But really, the grad schools don't normally do a lot of advising on how to get and do that first job at a place that's not, the University of Chicago. And so that would be my number one piece of advice to grad students.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's extremely useful because I mean it's arguably even more difficult in Europe and in Britain, where the number of jobs which specifically are about Islam are even fewer.
Yeah,
fewer.
they're
And
terrible.
sometimes the what is defined as Islamic studies is tends to be something like security studies, or something completely different for what you necessarily thought. And certainly texts, studying Arabic texts, for example, is becoming a bit of a luxury in many places, certainly at an undergraduate level. It's becoming a real luxury. So in that sense, I think it is important that we do communicate to our students that they have to see the big picture. And I would say that's what they really should be doing, because if they are in the study of Islam, they are in the study of the humanities. And so understanding what that actually means in a broader sense and making those connections is going to be useful for their research as well as their teaching profile.
And you have to remember that the people who are interviewing you, particularly if it's a smaller place and they haven't had somebody who does Islam before in their department, you might be the first person they've hired at that institution who deals with the Islamic world. They don't know anything, right? And what they do know might be, Islam is five pillars. So you need to find ways to communicate to people uh, that don't know about the field. You can't assume that you're having a dialogue on that, but also recognize that they know a lot about the stuff that they know about. Uh, and I mean, that's hard to do. I mean, uh, but I do think that being prepared for those kind of interviews and for those kinds of what should be obvious questions, what would you do in an intro religion course? You know, uh, can you come up with a course besides Introduction to Islam that would be suitable for our undergraduates?
Yeah,
Uh, and then have an idea of what books you might teach, or what articles you might have them read, or what three main ideas you want them to take away.
yeah,
Because they're hiring you to teach. You
yeah,
know, if you're going to Columbia, they're going to want to know what your research schedule is for the next 20 years. But if you're being hired to Central Michigan University, where I had my first job, they were going to want to know what can you do in the classroom.
yeah. That's Okay, so moving then to the book. Yes, if you could say a bit more about how you came to write the book, and then maybe we can use that to segue into also
Sure.
a bit more about the book.
I am not a very prolific writer. Uh, and after I wrote my first book, which was based on my dissertation, I had all kinds of ideas for things I might write as the next book and never got very far, in part because I teach at a liberal arts college and the emphasis there is on teaching. And as I look back on my career, I realized that what I've left behind isn't a stack of books. It's a silsila of students that I've taught. I'm really proud of the number of people when I look back who've gone on in the field, which is weird coming out of a little liberal arts college, right? Uh, People that a lot of your students may know who, went through my classrooms. And I see my legacy as being there, but that meant that most of my effort went there. So the book kept getting pushed back, and the book kept getting pushed back. And at a certain point, I realized that, alhamdulillah, that was probably all for the best because I then had 30 years of teaching and research projects that allowed me to really develop the idea for the book, which was to take the way that I think and teach about Islam, which I think is subtly different from the way a lot of other people do this, and put it together in a what I hope is a really coherent and readable fashion, so that I can pass this on. One of the things I'm most happy about is the way in which publication has now moved into trying to sell electronic versions to libraries. I may not make any money selling this book, to students, but lots of libraries have bought it, which means that faculty can assign chapters out of it to their students in their courses, and the ideas in the book can be spread out. And the basic, idea that I'm trying to get out there. Well, I had an alternative title for the book, but it struck me as a little cheeky, and I didn't mean to be saying anything bad about John Esposito because John's done a lot for the field. I was going to call it Islam's Diverse Paths as opposed to Islam the Straight Path. And as I say in the book, John's introductory text was a remarkable gift, despite the fact that I feel like it fundamentally makes a a mistake of a sort in trying to say that Arabic fiqh, kalam, Islam is the real Islam. And when I was asked to review the book for republication, at one point I noticed there's almost nothing on Islam after Baghdad falls to the Mongols up until the 19th century, which is when all the stuff that I'm most interested in happens, right? That's when Sufi tariqas emerge. That's when we get the rise of vernacular poetry. That's where we get the emergence of a sort of global version of Islam that's rooted in love for the Ahlul Bayt, love for the Awliya, and Vadat al-Wujud as the major way of interpreting tawhid. And so I wanted to find a way to put that in between covers. The number of people who still, when asked, what is Islam? And you look at almost every introductory book to world religions, is Islam is rooted in 5 pillars, right? And so we start with not just fiqh, but with those ibadat. And as Afakar Mustafa points out, the only one of those 5 pillars that every branch of Islam accepts is the Shahada. There are groups that don't do namaz. There are groups that don't go on the Hajj. There are all kinds of ways in which things are there. So one of the things that I did, and I took this from my professor at the University of Virginia, who the first course I took with him, Abdulaziz Sachedina, was rooted in this, is that instead of talking about the 5 pillars as the basis of Islam, I start by talking about the 3 usul shared by Sunni and Shia Muslims alike. That in order to be a Muslim, you have to believe in tawhid, you have to believe in nubuwwa, and you have to believe in qiyama. But they are so multivalent that you can find ways that you can put things as diverse as Ibn Taymiyyah's taqwa-centered monotheism and Alevi Islam that where Alevi Muslims don't say namaz, they don't go on the Hajj, and yet they both fit within the parameters of Islam. And that's what I wanted to do, was to demonstrate how Islam contains multitudes. And I'm sure there'll be questions later, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, I mean, I think that that is important because it's like, yes, a lot of introductions in the past, they kind of struggle precisely with this issue of how do you, um, in a sense, square Islam as a set of assents to certain kinds of truth claims, and then, the question of what is it that Muslims do, right? So it's kind of like how do you kind of marry the two up and then see how there's a basic kind of symbiotic relationship in a sense between the two, and how that manifests itself in different ways.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, so if you the actual book itself, if you can tell us a bit more about, you know, what is the argument of the book and how do you develop that argument?
Okay, that's a little complicated. Well, let's start with the title, right? I called the book Teaching Humanity because that's taken from the first surah of the Quran, not Fatiha, but Surah 96, 1 through 5, which is traditionally the first surah that was revealed, which reads, "In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, recite in the name of your Lord who created humanity insan from a clot. Recite, your Lord is most noble. He who taught by the knowledge of the pen taught humanity that which it knew not." And although the puns only work in English, uh, over the years I've come to believe that Islam is primarily built. Yes, Islam is, of course, rooted in tawhid, and it is a theocentric tradition in that, God's the center of the universe. God creates the universe. God supports the universe. But as Fazlur Rahman, I believe, once pointed out, Islam doesn't make any sense without somebody to receive the revelation. Without humanity, there's no point for Islam. Humanity is at the center. And I have come, if you look at the Quran, for example, it says Ya Insan many more times than it says O Muslims or O Mumins. It's directed at humanity. And I see Islam as a vehicle for teaching humanity. First off, teaching humanity, that God is one, that there are prophets, that we're morally responsible human beings, that sort of exoteric teaching. But it's also about teaching humanity, teaching human beings to transcend their animal nature, which is necessary for our existence in the material world, and truly become human. That there's a reason that the story of Adam is being created is told multiple times in the Quran. That the creation of humanity is also about us learning during our earthly existence how to become truly human. And thirdly, Islam's about various groups of teaching humanities. In other words, there are alims who teach what's in texts. There are murshids who teach the tariqah. There are prophets who teach everything, who bring the paths. And so one of the genius things about Islam for me is it's a tradition that has said God has chosen to teach human beings through the agency of human beings. And so the notion of insaniyat, of being a human being, is for me one of the crucial pieces of terminology in Islam, and one that's often pushed aside. If you begin with the notion that it's all about ibadat and it's what human beings are supposed to do, as opposed to what it's supposed to do to human beings, how it's supposed to change us, how it's supposed to make us into something more fully human, you get a very legalistic understanding of Islam in which Muslims become the new Pharisees. And in my opinion, the Pharisees were written the way they were in the Greek Testament because they're written to make Jesus win. Because look, in every human culture, there are stories told. Love always wins over the law. I don't care if it's in East Asian text or South Asian text or rom-coms or Islam. It's always the simple dervish, the simple monk who is able to show the paucity of the high, noble, educated theologian compared to their faith, which makes them into a loving human being. And so by really focusing on Islam as being about insaniyat, I'm pulled to the notion of Islam being about muhabbat and ishq. And instead of uh, Assad's notion that Islam is primarily a discursive tradition, I would argue that it is at least just as importantly, or more importantly, an affective tradition that wishes to use the notion of love in order to transform human beings into something closer to a notion of a perfected human or an insan al kamil, which isn't some weird hippie term. It's in the Quran. So there you go. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really important. Um, you know, I remember I think I was a fresher when I first read Michael Cook's little book on the Prophet, like Muhammad. It was one of those,
Yeah, yeah.
was it Oxford? Um, it wasn't this very short introductions. It was much before that, and and reading that little book, you get this notion that Islam is a very straightforward transaction, right? You do certain things and you earn certain things, and if you don't do certain things, you don't earn certain things, right? And it always struck me that um, this seemed to be a very odd way of doing things, not least because if it was that clear cut, most humans are terribly fallible, right? So they can't really be trusted to do, X, Y, and Z and fulfill them properly, and they can't really be trusted to forego A, B, and C as well. So it didn't seem to get to this whole question of, well, why would so many people from such different backgrounds and different kind of worldviews um, embrace this particular way of life?
Well, it strikes me that one of the reasons is that, we talk about Islamic values and Islamic virtues, is that, first off, most of the terms for virtues of what it is to be human in the Islamic world are originally taken from the Arabic, right? Sabr, tawakkul, amanat, right? But if we think about those terms, they aren't Mohabbat. Those aren't just Islamic terms. Those are universal. And that what Muslims were trying to do, I'm trying to remember when was it Bayezid? Somebody asked a Jew in the Middle Ages, why have you not converted to Islam? And I think the response was, if being a Muslim means being as good a man as Bayezid, I'm not capable of that. But if it means being as bad a man as you, I don't want to. Uh, that the idea that Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was trying to demonstrate that people should follow him because he most truly represented values that they already held as important, right? That it's you need to be humble, that you need to be kind, that you need to take care of the people on the bottom. These are, I mean, I do think that Islam does speak to insan, and that part of how Islam spread was by making a really powerful case that if you believe these things about what it is to be a human being, this path will help you to do it. Maybe that's, a little I get accused of being a hippie not just because my hair is long, but I'm not trying to make some kind of. I think this is in the historical text. I think you see it every Thursday and Friday night at shrines throughout the world. I think you see it in the ways in which aunties and uncles tell stories to the young people and their families about how to develop adab and akhlaq. All of this notion about adab. What is adab? It's about learning to be kind to other people, and that Islam has always been deeply rooted in it. That's why hospitality is so important. I also think it's really one of the things that really, as I began to write this book, is so many people who write particularly on Sufism focus on how important love is, and love is certainly important. But what about trust, right? The way in which faith comes from the same root
Mm.
as trust, the way in which the prophet is El Amin, the whole notion of what an amanat is, that
Mm.
Adam becomes the Khalifa because he alone in the cosmos accepts the amanat, that learning to be someone who is trustworthy is what a perfected human being is. I find this incredibly powerful and incredibly beautiful and incredibly central to what Islam is all about.
I think that that point about trust is and faith is quite important because, um, again, we tend to, a lot of us tend to come out of an education which emphasizes the rational agency of the individual, right? That we do things because we choose to do things after we've gone through some sort of process of deliberation. And and of course, while that kind of rational, philosophical, deliberative approach to theological texts, that clearly um, is not something which applies to very many people. And so, this idea of trust and how do you trust and on what basis do you trust, to make that kind of leap of faith, so to speak, strikes me as being quite central. And perhaps that is precisely where the affective comes in.
Well, as when I went to study about Muharram in Pakistan, a very wise person, Professor Karar Hussain, pointed out to me something really important, that when the first generation of Muslims became Muslim, there was almost no Quran. They didn't become Muslims because there was a book called the Quran that was all together. There were a few verses here and there. To become a Muslim was to give bayat to Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And why did people do that? Because they saw in the Prophet this person who radiated a set of virtues that was incredibly important to them. And it was that feeling of, this is a person whom we should follow, this is a person who we want to be like, that was so important in the first generation. And that, that's why you don't just say ashhadu la ilaha illallah, but also ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah, right? Not because of you're joining a tribe, but because the Prophet Muhammad represents what the later tradition came to over and over again define as the perfection of humanity. And so much so that people began to believe that he was the first thing created and God created a universe so that he could have a place to exist. I really remember that when I was an undergraduate, I overheard, well, I wasn't overheard, someone told me, if you want to study Islam, you need to study the biography of the Prophet Muhammad. And I said, okay, but in the back of my mind went, yeah, but isn't that shirk? Because, isn't Islam all about Allah? And if we put all this focus on the Prophet, and I started to realize I sounded like an 18th century Wahhabi burning down the tomb of the Prophet because it got in the way of love for Allah. And, there's a reason that it took me years to realize just how true it was. If you want to understand Islam, you really need to look at both the biography of the Prophet as we have it, and also how, in a more ethnographic sense, how Muslims understand who the Prophet is. And quite frankly, I don't think the field spends as much time talking about the Prophet as we do about the Quran. I mean, I could be wrong.
I think the interesting thing is that's starting to change. So, I mean, certainly I remember as an undergraduate, of course, you had Anne-Marie Chamel's book on devotion to the Prophet. Now that was so central, but um, most of the sort of studies of the Prophet or Hadith literature, etc., was not terribly focused on what does this mean for later people and practices. But of course, more recently, there has been a very large project, primarily in France, run by people like Denis Creel and others, very much looking at this whole question of, well, what does devotion mean? I mean, he himself has written a couple of really interesting recent books on devotion to the Prophet, and even to devotion to the Prophet's family as being central to Sufi and Islamic practice. So, in some ways, it is starting to come back, and of course, as you know, amongst anthropologists, it never went away. So, the
It didn't, and I'm glad you mentioned the Ahl Bayt because my first when I was doing my dissertation research, a Muslim colleague there said the one of the real questions we have to answer is, why do people feel the way about Ali that they, not just Shias, but everywhere. I will normally make a joke at least once in the semester when I have Muslims in my class and say, I think it's interesting that nobody ever said Ya Abu Bakr Madad, and everybody laughs.
Mm.
Uh, and they're mainly all Sunni Muslims, right? I mean, it's because even among Sunni Muslims, there's something different about Ali. That devotion to Ali is one of those linchpins that links the Islam of the 9th through the 19th century in ways that are, it's all throughout the poetry, all throughout numerous ideas. And so I'm really interested in why the Ahl Bayt are so important. And I think part of it is that, if Islam is so much about love for the Prophet Muhammad, as somebody, again, I learned a lot about Islam from just talking to people who told me things, right? Uh, if you want to say that you love God, how can you say you love God if you don't love the person, the Prophet that God loved more than anyone else? And that's the Prophet Muhammad. And if you say you love the Prophet Muhammad, how can you say that if you don't love the person that he loved most? And there is so much textual, historical, traditional memory about the relationship between Ali and Muhammad. My favorite story is one that I haven't been able to find a text for, but it's really beautiful that when Ali was born in the Kaaba, the midwives came out because he was holding a blanket over his face and they couldn't force it down. And so they went to get the Prophet to see if he could help. And when Muhammad came in, Ali dropped the blanket because he wanted the first thing he saw in this world to be his beloved. And of course, that's probably not a historical story, but it speaks volumes and it's really beautiful in a touching kind of way. And it's that notion of Islam as being about affect that I try to capture in this book as best as I can.
So can we go a bit more into the book? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah, so talk a bit about the contents in the chapter. So
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess what can I say? I mean, on one hand, it can be used as a sort of textbook. It has the kinds of things in it that one would expect in an introductory book about Islam. So that uh, the first chapter lies out the thinking about the book and why I wrote it and what I mean, my definition of Islam. The second chapter is basically talking about patterns of belief in Islam and using the three usuluddin of tawhid, nubuwwa, and qiyama as the basis for talking about Islam. Uh, all Muslims believe in the oneness of God, but for some, it's Ibn Arabi's Vedat al-Wujud, and for others, it's Ibn Taymiyyah's creator, who is always distinct from his creation. All Muslims believe in prophets and the prophet, but for some, the prophet is primarily a telephone receiver whose one uh, uh, miracle is the Quran, and for others, he's the beloved of God, who is the reason for creation itself. And for Qiyamah, for many Muslims, paradise and hell are exactly as they're described in the Quran, and others have said, no, that's just allegories. And then the Alevis and the Bektashi say, well, it's even different than that because eternity exists between every second. We're always in the Qiyamah. And those of us who have become human are living in Jannat, and those of us who are animals and don't know it are living in Jahannam. And the idea is to get out of Jahannam. But they all share the notion that human beings alone on this planet are morally responsible agents. And you can't be, I haven't found any Muslims that don't accept some notion of the fact that God is one, some notion of the fact that God teaches human beings through human beings, notion of prophecy. And the third, that human beings are responsible moral agents who will be, in some sense, this has an impact on what happens to us. So then the third chapter deals with questions of shari'a, the notion that there is a Shi Islam, a Sunni Islam, discussion about the things you might expect. Who was the Prophet Muhammad? What happened in the early periods of Islam? The fourth chapter is on the Quran, which is difficult for me because I'm not a scholar of Arabic, but we could talk about that in more detail. I want to talk about how the Quran works and how it functions, particularly as most Muslims aren't Arabic speakers. And so, how do they use the Quran? And I think one of the ways they use it is that the Quran provides elements of vocabulary for defining what a human being is meant to be, but I also focus on certain stories in the Quran that I think are fundamental. The Adam story, the Khizr Musa story. Lots of books on Islam will say that the Quran is different than the Bible because it doesn't have any narratives. It does have narratives, and they're crucial. But for me, the beauty of the Quran is that it's like a glass of salt water. No matter where you sip in it, you're going to get atoms of hydrogen, atoms of oxygen, atoms of sodium, atoms of chlorine. It's not arranged with all the theology over here and all the stories about prophets here. Wherever you dip in as if you're dipping into the world. And so I actually think that doesn't show the Quran as an incomprehensible book. It shows it as a remarkable mirror of reality itself. The next chapter is on devotional allegiance to person. Who are God's friends? I talk about Prophet Muhammad. I talk about Ali. I talk about Imam Hussein. And then I talk about the Sufi awliya as persons who represent people I love the Turkish translation of the word awliya, erenler, which means those who have arrived. And these are the people who have become insan al-kamal, who can guide us. So the idea that we should have love for those people who can be our guides. And then the sixth chapter is probably in some ways pretty unique to me. When I was in Uzbekistan researching the return of Sufism after the fall of the Soviet Union, I got interested in Turkey and Turkish out of Uzbek. And when I got to Turkey, I heard the remarkable nefes music of people like Arif Zah and Musa Erol, and I became fascinated with the Alevi tradition. The incredible music, the incredible poetry, and the fact that there exists a kind of Islam that believes in Vedatul Wujud, believes in love for the Prophet, believes in love for Ali, and yet doesn't really care much about what they call Beish Ibadat, the five pillars. For them, we must always be in prayer in the heart. And the question is, how do you do that? And so looking at Alevi Islam as an example of, not to demean Sharia-minded Islam, because let's face it, Sharia has its own beauty, right? And Sharia-mindedness is important for millions and millions and millions and millions of Muslims. But we can't be confused into thinking that Sharia is usul in the way that tawhid is usul. And so looking at the Alevi path as a kind of Islam that is outside of our normal way of thinking about it is what that chapter is about. The last chapter is the one I'm actually most proud of, in which I try to lay out a different notion of a mainstream Islam, which kind of goes against the whole point of the book. The whole point of the book is that, on one hand, we shouldn't say there's a real Islam defined as Arabic Islam rooted in fiqh and kalam, and then compare everything else to it. But then I come along and say, well, is there a mainstream Islam? And what would that mainstream Islam look like? And I think that that mainstream Islam over the course of history has actually been, I mean, the Islam of most people at the level of popular culture has been an Islam that accepts Vedatul Wujud as the most likely way that we should interpret tawhid, believes in the necessity of love for the Prophet and the Ahl Bayt, and generally believes that the Awliya Allah exist and that they can help us in the world, and that Islam has been here for a very long time. Now, I think in the 19th century, the critics of that kind of Islam, and they've always been there, right? They go all the way back to Ibn Taymiyyah. But it's funny, if you read medieval texts, people were really critical of Ibn Taymiyyah. He wasn't all that popular when he was alive. I'm having a senior moment here. The guy who wrote the travelogue from Morocco that I teach almost every year, Ibn
Ibn
Battuta.
Yeah.
Ibn Battuta is really cruel to Ibn Taymiyyah, right? That I think in part because of colonialism and the rise of modernity, and people who were saying that, oh, religion can't be superstitious and religion has to be modern. People who began to come along and say, no, Islam is a perfect, rational, sociological system. The voices of people like Maududi, who brought with them a very strong anti-Sufi message, that became something that I've noticed it in the years that I've been teaching, that among my Muslim students, there was a kind of, we're not interested in this Sufi stuff. It's kind of superstition. It's backwards. It's a long time ago. In the last 10 years, I've seen a lot more interest in it among young diaspora Muslims and Muslims coming from abroad. And for many of them in my classes, it's the first time they've read Mawlana. It's the first time they've read, Ibn Arabi. It's the first time that they've read, and yet they knew about this stuff because, everybody knows poetry about Halaj. I mean, it's one of the things I point out. The Muslim world knows about Halaj pretty much from Morocco to Indonesia. Nobody remembers the names of the people who signed his death warrant. And many of those people who love Halaj and believe in Halaj, those are people who also want to say their prayers 5 times a day and keep the fast. It's not that, on the one hand, we have this antinomian sort of view of Islam. The Sufi tradition that I'm talking about has not been particularly antinomian. I think that's been one of the mistakes, is to read it in opposition to the Sharia, whereas it's a way of incorporating the Sharia for a different purpose. So anyhow, I think I'm starting to become confusing. It's hard to take a 240-page book and put it all together there, but I hope this is making sense.
I think that's a very good summary, and I want to actually move to any questions from the audience as well. I mean, I think for me, what's really interesting precisely is this way in which we can approach Islam in an expansive manner, precisely so that you can actually include Alevis in that, because certainly most introductions to Islam I've ever come across would not discuss Alevis, right? And
Or they would call them heterodox or
yeah.
syncretic.
Yeah, so that,
And
and it doesn't kind of, begin to deal with this question of how do you have an expansive notion which is not, too elastic, for example. And I think that's always the real kind of challenge in most works which are trying to, theorize what we can meaningfully mean by the term Islam. Yeah.
before we go to questions, just so we don't leave the part that's online with me sort of rambling on in different ways, I think there's a hadith that sort of sums up the part of Islam that I foreground in this book. Because it's not that I leave out, the things that would be in the more standard text. I talk about fiqh, I talk about kalam, I talk about, the things you would need to the life of the Prophet, the things you would need to have in an introduction to Islam. But there's a hadith that I have found particularly powerful in looking at this other kind of Islam that I think needs to be foregrounded. And it's related to the hadith of I was a hidden treasure and would be known. And that's that I created everything for you and you for me. And that is sometimes interpreted to mean I created everything for you, meaning the Prophet Muhammad, that in order for the Prophet Muhammad to take physical form, there had to be a universe that he could live in. But I created the Prophet for me. But that also can be interpreted and has been in aspects of the Sufi tradition as humanity. If alone in all the universe there is a creature that is able to, God creates a universe that is so full of wonder, right? In which everything is maintained in balance by jazba, which is kind of another word for gravity, right? The attraction of things keeps everything going. But how many billions of years did the universe exist before there were creatures with eyes to see it? And how many millions of years after that was there finally Adam, who traditionally, by the way, is described as almost as if he is, Homo erectus, a creature who could not only see the world, but look around and recognize that this was created by a creator and wanted to know and love that creator. And I think that that foregrounding of the role of human beings, therefore, within Islam is rooted in that hadith. I created everything for you. I wanted to be known. I needed a creature to know me. That's humanity. And now I'm going to bring a path, a series of paths called Islam, to facilitate your ability to do that because I want us to be in a relationship of knowledge and love. That's what this book is about.
Cool. That's a good way to wrap it up. So let me stop recording and I am going to open it up